Okay, we're going to go to Sydney and speak to Antony Loewenstein, who's an independent journalist, also author of the book My Israel Question. Antony was based in occupied East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020. Antony, welcome back. And we bring you on periodically because, look, we find that you give us an incisive overview of the situation. And because of this operation that has just started by the Israeli military in the occupied West Bank, we wanted to bring you back to analyze this moment. What's happening there in the occupied territories? Is it Zionism or is it Israeli foreign policy? Or have they become the same thing?
It's one and the same thing. And I mean, ultimately, what Israel's doing in the West Bank now since October 7, but certainly long before, is really an attempt to try to push as many people out as possible. I mean, Palestinians. The idea of doing something similar to the West Bank as is happening in Gaza, on the one hand, seems inconceivable. On the other hand, if you make life so unbearable, so unlivable, what Israel has hoped for years is that Palestinians simply leave somewhere, Jordan, Egypt, God knows where. And the long-term aim of Israel has always been, frankly, since 1948, but even more so since 1967, is to settle the land, is to push out Palestinians from their own territory to somewhere else, to a neighbouring country, Jordan or wherever it may be. And unfortunately, many Arab countries in the last decades, I'm talking about Arab leaders here, not the Arab people, have pretty much gone along with that. I mean, ultimately, who is stopping Israel doing this? Nobody. I mean, there's sort of faux ceasefire negotiations happening in Cairo. It's an illusion of negotiations with the intention to allow Israel to continue its war in Gaza, clearly, but also a smokescreen for what's happening in the West Bank under the guise of we're dealing with the Iranian threat. That's what Israel claims. I mean, this essentially gives them carte blanche to do what they want. But ultimately, and it comes back to the same point over and over again, Israel does not and will not feel security through any of this. All of these activities are making Israel more unsafe, more insecure, both now and into the future. And the smarter Israelis realize that.
Okay, so therefore, look, if you've got a little scratch in your throat, Antony, I'm going to give you 20 seconds, have a drink of coffee, and let's tell the viewers this. Peace Now, the international group, says the Israeli government has approved the construction of nearly 13,000 new settler homes in the occupied West Bank. It's the largest expansion it's recorded since starting to collect data in 2012, with the government of Netanyahu approving the building of more than 18,500 new homes for illegal settlers in the West Bank since December 2022. And as you say, no one is stopping Israel. So what's the future of the occupied West Bank if Benjamin Netanyahu stays as the leader?
Well, what needs to happen, and I think there's growing rumblings of maybe this happening, are sanctions. And I'm not talking about what the EU and the US have done so far in the last year or so, which is sanctioning a handful of radical Israeli settlers. It is sanctioning members of the Israeli government. I note this week, the EU Foreign Affairs Chief openly says we, as the EU, need to sanction Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Now, he says the chances of getting consensus in the EU is slim, but you can have individual countries doing so. The only way this will change, this being what's happening in Gaza, the West Bank, is economic pain on Israel. It's the only way, it's the only language that Israel will understand, economic pain. And at the moment, frankly, Israel's able to do this because you have in the US, in the EU and elsewhere, for example, tax-deductible organizations sending money to the settlements. This is what is happening day after day after day. So if there is a sense that the Israeli government is made a pariah, this government, and frankly most governments for years, that can change the equation, that there is a price to be paid for this kind of complete violence and illegality. Without that, we are long past simply talking about we're concerned, the two-state solution. We have radical, far-right Jewish fascists in government in Israel using American taxpayer dollars and weapons to kill and ethnically cleanse Palestinians. At what point, and the point is now, will this stop? And it can only stop with economic pressure and pain. And that is starting very slowly to happen.
Do you think there's going to be a wider uprising in the occupied West Bank? And possibly, is that something that the Israeli government wants to see happen to give it even further excuses to assault Palestinians?
Look, it's certainly something that some in Israel would very much want to justify, as you say, whatever activities they have. Look, it's hard to say because, on the one hand, many Palestinian friends of mine in the West Bank and, frankly, in Gaza are exhausted. Exhausted. I mean, the West Bank is not Gaza, but in the West Bank, they're exhausted. Decades of occupation and, frankly, former intifadas have made a lot of Palestinians tired, exhausted. On the other hand, there is undeniably in the last years growing legitimate resistance to Israeli occupation from Jenin, Nablus, and elsewhere. Now, my sense is that there's unlikely to be a mass organized resistance against the occupation of these kinds of activities. It'll be more kind of targeted resistance from small militant groups. But ultimately, this is pushing people to the edge. And as you say, Israel wants that. But what it does not understand, or at least the government doesn't seem to understand after decades of doing this, is that none of this brings them security. It's the illusion of security through force. And at some point, and October 7 in some ways was an explosion of that reality, none of this is going to bring them security and safety, both as a Jewish state within the region or Jews globally. And there will come a point where, and we're not that far away from that point, where Israel as a Jewish state in itself, the legitimacy of that state in many parts of the world ended a long time ago. The danger that Israel faces is in Western capitals. I mean, to have an EU leader calling for sanctions on an Israeli government, although yes, it's just talk so far, is unprecedented. And that needs to be put into action because without that, this will not change.
Antony Loewenstein, you know it. We appreciate it. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you so much.